let's take a look at the top decks for the Players' Cup. Welcome back, everyone, to more from the Sableyes. I'm Mitch, and we are live on twitch.tv/thesableyes to do a little bit of a tier list for you. We're going to be looking at all of the decks that we're expecting to see for the Players' Cup over the next week and a half, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however long it goes for. I'm here with Stefan and Sam. How are we doing, gentlemen?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, not bad, mate.
That is good, and we're going to run through all the decks that we think are going to be solid picks, something that you can expect to see for your Players' Cup tournament. Now, Tier 1 are decks that are going to be, the absolute best of the best, the ones that we're expecting to win. Tier 1.5 is like, this is a good deck, but it's not quite there. Tier 2... probably not, but you could expect to see some, and doubtful is... Mitch, why did you put that on the tier list? So that's our general ranking system. Now, I will say this. Baby Blacephalon is supposed to be here, but unfortunately the picture is gone. For whatever, we just cannot get the picture to work. So it won't appear on the tier list, but we'll start with it. Gentlemen, where do we think we should be putting Baby Blacephalon? Stefan, I'll start with you.
I gotta personally sort of weight it towards the doubtful tier, but I think that's more out of personal distaste
personal
than anything
grievance.
I think Baby Blans is always one of those decks that's a little bit hard to rate because it's always about just how well it draws on the day. So I'd be inclined to put it somewhere 1.5 to something like that.
1.5. Sam, what about yourself?
Yeah, I was thinking it's probably not good enough to be 1. I think 1.5 is fair enough for it. I think in the current format, it's an incredibly strong deck, but it does have a few tricky matchups against some of the other top tier decks. And 1.5 is still pretty damn good for the
Yeah,
it's like on the fringe of being good.
Yeah, it's right on the cusp. 1.5 for me is a pretty fair spot, just because I think that it's got good matchups against lots of the decks that we're eventually going to put in Tier 1. I think it does struggle against a couple of decks floating around at the moment. I know Dragapult is a bit of an issue for it. There's a lot of other decks that can kind of give Blacephalon some trouble, and obviously Blacephalon's biggest enemy is itself. So if it just doesn't draw well, it's just absolute garbage, much worse than other decks that, you can kind of get away with having a turn or two that aren't super good. 1.5 seems fair. Let's start putting some pictures into boxes now. We'll start with ADP Zacian. And Sam, I know that this is one of the decks that you are most excited for.
I mean, it's the deck that I'm probably going to actually play for the Players' Cup, if I'm being honest with you.
Sure.
But I will be honest, I'd probably just leave it where it is at 1.5. I would love to say this is a tier 1 deck, but the reality is that in the current climate, it's not. It's very close to being a good deck, but I think compared to things like Dragapult and Turbo Zacian especially, it's just that little bit too slow, even with things like Energy Switch. And in order to, have a matchup against things like Blacephalon and whatnot, you need to throw in way too many techs. And so for a competition like this, you just can't really give it tier 1 unless you're sacrificing really important matchups. So I'm cool with 1.5.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. We'll just jump into the Twitch chat for a second. We've got some people chucking around some statistics for Baby Blacephalon. Just in the defense of it, it does have 28 top 8 finishes in online tournaments, which is the 4th best of the lot. So maybe 1.5 might be a little bit harsh on it. Stefan, what do you think about ADP Zacian?
ADP Zacian, I like it as a deck that can kind of just punish anything that's sort of drawing a little underwhelmingly. Like it's a deck that can close out games really, really quickly. Which I don't think Turbo Zacian can do, because it can be a little bit more fragile in assembling all of its bits. But I think just how bad ADP Zacian loses to Baby Blounds is the thing that is keeping it out of that tier 1 spot.
Yeah.
I do still think it matches really well into Dragapult, but it's I wouldn't go so far as to say favored,
Yeah, it's kind of an awkward one. The fact that you do need to kind of get that perfect setup right to get the Altered Creation going second is really bad for ADP Zacian. If you don't get the Energy Switch, can potentially pose some problems. And yeah, the Baby Blacephalon matchup is pretty rough. There's some good ones, and I wouldn't be surprised if it does see some play. I know it's definitely on my list of decks that I'm interested in playing for the Players' Cup, but I'm not sure that it is quite to that level just yet. Let's take a look.
One thing I'll say before we move on, I just
sure.
want to say this. as a person who really does love ADP Zacian, I think that until rotation, it will never be tier 1, but post-rotation, it goes back to tier 1.
Okay, fair enough. Well, it was tier 1 for a very long time, so I think it's fair that it maybe just takes a break for a second and let some other ones go full broke. Let's look at something else that might also fit into that little 1.5 tier 1 tier. This is Pikachu Zekrom. It's a deck that I know a lot of American players are really hyping up. It's a deck that lots of people call the most consistent deck in the format, but if you're watching our conquest against Henry, PikaRom can definitely fall apart. I'm personally not a big fan of PikaRom. I don't think that there's enough that it can do to win a big event, but it is good enough that if you get that turn 1 full blitz, you can definitely do some damage. I'm going to chuck it in 1.5 because I don't think that it's quite there, but it can definitely do a lot of damage. It's a solid pick. Anyone else? Stefan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. I think PikaRom is really strong, and it does have like really, really high consistency, not to be observed in the Sableye Conquest series.
Oh no, not at all.
But I think the thing that it struggles with is just there's a few too many matchups out there. It just can't stand, and I think that probably keeps it out of tier 1 to me. But I do think it is like it's a solid pick, and if it's something you're familiar with going into the cup as well, like
if this has been your really pet deck for like the last 12 months since Team Up came out, then this is probably a really, really good choice. For me, someone who's never really played PikaRom, probably not, but I know that there are some players who really love it, and I mean, the Americans are all over it. They reckon it's number 1, so definitely a really, really good call. We're getting some calls in the chat that there was 58 top 8 finishes for PikaRom, so that's the second most, so maybe we're being a little bit harsh on it. Sam, what do you think?
Like, it's a very consistent deck, which is probably why it's had so many top 8s, but I think that a lot of the online competitions have been best of 1s, as far as I'm aware, and heading into the Players' Cup, I believe, is best of 3s. And I feel like in a best of 1, you might be able to have certain strategies with PikaRom that can pay off, but if your opponent just knows them after game 1, then normally in game 2 and 3, they might be able to construct their strategy a bit better. And like a lot of lists now, through different formats, have been, taking in Mew from Unbroken Bonds to try and shut down that tag bolt action. And it's the same with like Blasty, because obviously against Baby Blasty, everyone was taking Infinity to beat it. So it's an easily techable thing. I think it'll definitely be up there, but I don't think it is tier 1 in a best of 3 format.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, well, it sounds like we're all in agreement. Let's talk about a deck that very easily could be in tier 1, and that is Combo Zacian. What do we think about this one? I personally really like the concept, but the kind of the output of it, I'm not sure about. It's its last chance to do really well, Sam. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think tier 1's fair enough. I think it's proven that it is a very strong and consistent deck in the meta. Obviously not the same consistency as PikaRom, but in the sense of consistently getting off the combos, and obviously it had a lot of success due to that metal goggles glitch.
That is a bit of an issue, but it's gone now. It's been fixed, so Dragapult has a chance to win.
I still think it's very strong in the current meta. The combo, as it stands, is just really stupid. It means you don't have to waste a turn like you would in ADP Zacian, which is obviously the appeal that people have for it over ADP Zacian right now. I think it's good enough to be tier 1. I think in a best of 3 format, I'd say that 2 out of 3 games, you're most likely going to be able to consistently get that combo off, and that could just win a game on its own. Yeah, and that's all you need to do, right? If you can hit into something, take 3 or 4 prizes, an extra one than you're usually supposed to take, then you're going to be fine. And like we're talking about PikaRom being the most consistent deck in the format, but I mean, Combo Zacian has 4 Zacian in it, and this card is so good for that early game consistency that it is above and beyond those really, really strong decks. Stefan, do you want to add anything to Combo Zacian?
Yeah, no, I think it's very well placed in tier 1 personally. It has, like, you go first with it. It has one of the best going first abilities in the game, an Intrepid Sword, which does an incredible amount for it. And sometimes going second, you can just rip the nuts and take 3 prizes off of killing some random V Pokemon. You can just kill a Dragapult V for 3 prizes with the full combo, and that's it. That's the game.
Yep, that's done. There's nothing else you can realistically do. I like it. Tier 1 for me. I'm probably not going to play it. just because I haven't had as much practice as I really need to actually play it very well, but it is definitely very, very good. Now, let's talk about a deck that I have had a lot of practice with, but isn't probably quite as good. We'll represent it with Heatran here. It's, we're going to call it, I don't know, like a Firebox? Like, what kind of deck do we call this anymore? We used to call it Ability Zard, but doesn't really play Reshizard as often anymore. These Fireboxes are floating around. I know in Oceania, the player who actually came first in our tournament ladder played Firebox a lot in that time period, so it's a good deck. And if you can get it going with Welder going second, then you're going to have some success. But I don't think it has quite what it takes to beat the top tier decks. It really depends on the amount of good matchups. It does obviously hit for weakness on things like Luca Metal, which is a deck we'll talk about in a minute. It can deal massive damage. There's lots of good stuff going, but it does play Welder, Stefan. So I don't know if we can call it any more than like a tier 2 deck at the moment.
Yeah, I won't lie. I'm kind of leaning down towards Doubtful. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have the kick that it did in the past.
For sure.
Things are just a little bit too big and a little bit out of range, and yeah, it just feels really, really awkward to play, and you're not getting the same kind of clean lines that you used to with these Firebox style of decks. You could just dump 4 energies on a Reshizard and kill 90% of the things in the game.
Yeah.
Like, unfortunately,
what a time
yeah.
that was.
you need to get a really massive Hot Burn GX or find something insane, and even the thing that it really had going for it, which was the Ninetales, which was one of the best gust mechanics in the game. Now we have bosses orders, and everyone has access to that stuff. And most often, you just lose your Ninetales out of it. So,
yeah, it's kind of awkward. Sam, what do you think?
I think that Firebox suffers from the same issue that Welder Mewtwo suffered, that the 300 damage cap that it could consistently get to is not knocking out everything in the meta, and so therefore it loses its potential in the meta. There's not really much else to say. I don't think it hits hard enough. It's got good consistency, don't get me wrong, but yeah.
For sure, yeah, no, I agree. I'm not going to put it down in Doubtful. I think we're going to leave it in Tier 2 just because I know
It's fine.
I know what other decks we've got on this list, and there are some ones that are much worse than Firebox. So
the thing that Firebox has going for it too, I will say, is that out of a lot of the decks on this list, I will say it probably has one of the better matchups against things like Mill.
Yeah, that's fair.
Due to the Ninetales. It gives it a relatively good matchup against that.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, in that case, let's talk about Mill next. Now, I've got that as a Chinchino here. Whether that's the most accurate representation of Mill anymore, I'm not sure. I know Magcargo Mill's around, like Sleepy Mill or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of that kind of stuff floating around. Now, if you've seen any of our content, I hate this deck, like with a passion, and I don't understand why anyone would play a deck that just doesn't let your opponent play the game. It's just not fun. But you can't deny that it is quite strong. I'm not going to go as far as to say that it's a Tier 1 deck, because it's definitely not, but it could potentially sneak into that Tier 1.5 if people don't prepare for it. Sam, what do you think?
I mean, I knew we'd have to talk about this deck. Yeah, I mean, it's probably 1.5 or 1. I would say 1.5 over 1. It's a good deck. Like, I'm not going to beat around the bush, and I'm not going to be one of those people that says that it's a terrible strategy, because it's a way to win a game.
Oh, for sure.
As we see with any other, like, sport, if you may, like, these strategies can be really potent. And, I mean, it's not my pick, for sure.
Yeah, no,
but 1.5...
You're trying to be very, very diplomatic about that one. It's like, I wouldn't play it.
The thing is, right, we can all agree, I think Mill is probably the worst deck to play against.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It is an incredibly satisfying feeling when you beat Mill, but it is incredibly frustrating for 95% of that game. But that does come down to the fact that Mill has a lot of effective strategies that can just shut down a lot of decks and force your opponents to be really upset. So, I mean, if you're into that, then sure.
Then go for it.
Play Mill. It's probably 1.5.
It's up to
I
you.
Certainly won't be playing it, but, that's okay.
Yeah, we can't control
If that's the kind of fun you enjoy, then go nuts.
Yeah, no, for sure. Stefan, what do you think?
I would briefly add that Mill probably tied with Baby Barnes for most frustrating to play against. Because in neither of them, the game is involved in your hands.
Yeah, exactly. You can't do anything about it. You just got to sit there and watch your opponent solitaire, and hopefully they miss something. So, but I can at least get behind losing to Baby Blounce because they've knocked something out. Like, I can control what is on my field. I can't control whether I have energy or not. That's really annoying.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Stefan, carry on.
No, all good. The thing about Mill is it's one of those decks that has this like constant sort of chase of like tech where
Yeah.
you know, they tech one thing to deal with a meta threat, so you're teching against that thing, and it becomes this race of whoever's like the most advanced and big brain on the day. It's kind of like at IC where we saw the like Stinger GX into non GX Blacephalon, like the psychic damage spread Blacephalon,
Yeah.
and then they were counter teching Aerodactyl GX, and then in return people were taking the Poi Pole so that you could actually Stinger using the Naganadel GX.
Yeah.
It just becomes this chase of like weird techs, and I think that's the thing that keeps it up there, is that it just has access to so much stuff, not
sure.
needing much energy for its attacks, that it can constantly try to outthink its opponent, and that's what keeps it up there.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
It theoretically has an answer for everything as long as it makes its way into the deck list.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly does. Thanks very much, Heiter Hermanson. Hopefully I pronounced that one right for the follow. If you want to follow us on twitch.tv/thestabilizer, go across there if you're watching on YouTube. Yeah, Mill is a big pain in the butt, but it is definitely one of those decks that can do well when people aren't prepared for it. And I don't think there's going to be that many people that are prepared for it in Players' Cup. Like, I don't think a lot of people are talking about it. So, like, if you want to really enjoy your 3 weeks of Players' Cup, then maybe Minccino Mill is for you. Now, Stefan, you mentioned before that kind of Mew way of dealing with Mew, so we might as well, dealing with Mill, sorry, we might as well talk about Mew now. Now, I've got this represented as a Malamar, so this is Malamar Mewtwo. Where do we reckon we should put this? I think this is like a tier 2 deck as well. I don't think it's super strong, but it's definitely got some tricks and it can deal with some stuff, but I don't think that it's going to be able to deal with things like Dragapult.
Yeah, Dragapult seems like a really rough matchup unless you're running the Jirachi. And even then, a lot of the Dragapult lists are running Power Plant, so it doesn't exactly save you a lot of the time unless you're running Swell. I don't know, I think it's just another deck that suffered from the power creep that Rebel Clash has provided. Especially, you know, like the strategy obviously in the IC with the Mew deck used to just be, I'm going to Horror House one Pokemon and then just try and knock it out and win, but that just doesn't really happen anymore, and the damage just isn't really high enough anymore.
Yep.
So yeah,
I could definitely see that. It's a pretty risky pick. Like, you could put it in Doubtful. I'm not sure. Stefan, what do you think? You can be the casting vote here. What do you think? Is this like a tier 2 deck? Is this acceptable to play? Or is this just a deck that you're playing because why not?
I'd put it in 2. I think it's like... It doesn't seem horrific against anything other than Dragapult. I think the fact that Dragapult is such a bad matchup keeps it really far down, but I don't think it matches up that poorly against everything else. I think there's still quite a lot of things around it can deal with, and have some sort of unique and interesting strategies to deal with a lot of these decks. So I think it can sit comfortably in tier 2.
Yeah, fair enough. No worries. We got some people saying in the chat that maybe we should chuck it down in Doubtful or even the green section down below. So possibly not everyone's favourite deck, but I think tier 2 is fair. Thanks very much, Campos, for the follow. Appreciate it. Now let's talk about some decks that maybe are a little bit more doubtful before we get into some more of those higher tier ones. Now, we've spoken about these on the channel a little bit. We've taken a look at things like Inteleon VMAX and Rillaboom VMAX before. Both of these decks are definitely legitimate strategies, but for me, I would be very, very doubtful playing both of these decks in the Players' Cup. They don't really do enough. They're cool to have some fun with on the ladder, but I'm not entirely sure that they are the best choice. Sam, would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, the only one that I'd put potentially in tier 2 would be Rillaboom, but even that's a bit of a stretch right now. Maybe next format it'll be better, but right now it's just not really there.
Yeah, no, these decks can do stuff for sure. Like, they're not bad, but I don't think if I'm playing like a tournament where I have to play Combozation, Dragapult, PikaRom, ADP, Baby Blacephalon, these decks are just, they're not going to do enough, Stefan. They're not going to do enough.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I don't think there's not really too much to say about them. I think they can sit in Doubtful.
Yeah, and I think another Pokemon that can join it there is Toxtricity VMAX. I've seen a bit more of this floating around at the moment. I think it's Toxtricity's last chance to really do anything, because it's going to lose a lot of potency once Electro Power rotates. I'm personally not expecting to see any of this in the Players' Cup, but the fact that today, whilst I was off stream practicing some stuff and trying to set up all of our stuff on the stream, I came across like 3 of these in a row, so just kind of jogged my memory. I don't think this is very good, but people are obviously thinking about it. Sam, have you got any thoughts about Toxtricity at all? Sounds like a no. Sounds like a no from Sam.
Yeah, no, sorry. My internet is not only cutting in and out, but I just had nothing positive to say about Toxtricity VMAX. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's
like
fair.
in my eyes, I'm like, why would you not just play PikaRom if you're gonna run a lightning deck?
Yeah, fair enough. That makes a lot of sense. Stefan, I presume you agree.
Actually, not necessarily. I think it definitely sits in doubtful, but I've seen like firsthand that the deck definitely does do some things that PikaRom doesn't. One of them being it doesn't die immediately.
Yes.
It is really big, and it's not too hard to set up. Like, it does require a bit of setup to get that like Garbodor Toxtricity and the 3 energy, but I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a deck to be underestimated in the long term, particularly if Electric gets more support as it always does.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I like Toxtricity for some fun, but I don't think it's a good pick for this particular tournament. A sneaky pick that might be a good one is Dark Box. We got Weavile here. Everyone's talking about Dragapult. We haven't put it up on the list yet. It's probably one of the top tier decks, and Dark Box is a pretty hard counter to it. Obviously, if it sets up, that is. If it doesn't set up, then it's obviously in a bit of trouble, but you could potentially see some floating around. I don't know if we want to put this in Tier 2 or in Doubtful. Stefan, what do you think?
I think it's fine in Tier 2. I actually quite like it as a strong deck. I personally could never play a deck that says, if I prize Darkrai Prism, I'm just kind of out of the game. I've had enough experience prizing my one-ofs in the past. You know, that one-of Tapu Lele GX really... It's not fun to do, and to have your deck just cease to function on that one axis, I couldn't do it.
No,
I think
enough.
It sits nicely in 2, however.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Sam, what do you think?
2 seems pretty solid for it. I mean, don't get me wrong, we thought for a little bit it could be a way to break the meta, but unfortunately, I think the deck half the time just loses to itself. So Tier 2 is fine.
And we've actually just had a really, really good comment in the chat. Darkbox kind of reminds us of Greninja Break. It's one of those decks that, if it does work, it's pretty much like unbeatable. There's lots of stuff that it can do, but sometimes it just loses straight out to itself. So that's probably not a good sign going into a big tournament. Now, we've talked about things that can beat Dragapult. We might as well talk about Dragapult now. If you've watched any of our streams over the last couple of days, I think this deck sits comfortably in Tier 1 and is probably the best deck in the format at the moment. Everyone should probably be trying to beat Dragapult if you're not going to play it, because it will be there. I will almost certainly be playing it, and it's definitely a Tier 1 deck for me. But I know that some people are not as comfortable with that call, saying that it's the best deck in the format. And Sam has gotten grumpy at me for playing things that are playing only Dragapult for the entire time. So, Sam, talk us through Dragapult, why it's in Tier 1 for sure 100%, and why you think it's maybe not the best choice.
It probably is the best choice. Like, I just pull your chain, man. It's like...
Let's gotta slow down. Let's get too excited about it.
Like, Dragapult is a very good deck. I mean, sure, like, realistically, the only counters that people can really run against it for this Players' Cup, I would say, is the beefy decks can run Mallow and Lana, and the little decks could maybe run things like the Giratina from Unified Minds with Scoop Up Net to try and deny that horror energy, but Dragapult's running more counts of regular energy, and some Dragapult lists are even running a Malamar line now to counteract energy denial. Yeah. So they've got so many facets on countering that. And like the decks that run Malolana, like don't get me wrong, I'm an ADP player, so I run Malolana, obviously. But there are so many times where I'm like, I really wish I didn't have to use the supporter for my turn, and I could use anything else to gain leverage in this matchup. So I think Dragapult just has too much going for it right now. It'll be interesting to see how it goes next format without things like Mysterious Treasure, but for now, it just has all the resources it needs to be a Tier 1 deck.
Yeah, no, fair enough. We just had another comment in the chat. It's got 130 attack for 2 energy. That sounds like a doubtful deck to me. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, very good. Stefan, what do you think?
Yep, I don't really have much to add. It's a deck that asks for so little and gives
does.
so much.
Yeah, it's going to move it to the left there. There we go. It's the best.
It benefits from demanding very little deck space for like the core thing that you want to do, which you can then dedicate the surrounding elements to be so much like powerful things for the current format that you're in. And that's why I think this deck isn't one that's going to sort of go away anytime soon, because you can build around it so easily and build for the current format.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point that I think we probably look over quite a lot, is that the core Dragapult deck in itself needs all of 7 cards that are Dragapults, and then everything else you can kind of pick and choose what you want. It's why we've seen so much variety. I think the channel, we've done like 4 or 5 different profiles on Dragapult, some that are better than others obviously, but there's just so much flexibility with it. Like, you don't ever know the exact 60 that you're going to be playing against. In Players Cup you're going to know those counts, but you know, it's one of those things where if you're playing against Dragapult, you never quite know which direction they're going to go, and there are a lot of plays that you can make in the game to kind of swing those matchups in your favor. So I really like it. We'll have to see how it goes. I suspect that this is going to be a deck that either wins the Players Cup overall or has a large percentage of players qualifying with it. So I'm a big fan of it. Here's a deck that I've actually found beats Dragapult quite comfortably though, and that is our kind of Luca Metal Zacian decks that are floating around at the bit. Full Metal Wall is a real pain to deal with if you're playing a Dragapult list. So I think this is a 1.5 deck, but I might be jumping the gun a little bit. I'm not sure. Stefan, what do you think?
I like it in 1.5. I think the popularity of Dragapult carries this deck really far. I also think the weakness of fire decks right now carry it far, outside of Baby Blacephalon. But even then it has access to things like Frying Pan, so it's not necessarily an auto loss. And I think if this deck can pace itself really well and sort of take control of the tempo of the game, it's just going to run over a lot of things. I think it's just going to struggle with some consistency issues and overall power and like closing out games against Dragapult. But it does feel really good like going into this tournament.
Yeah, I like that kind of that. There's kind of an aggressive defensiveness to it. It's just so big and bulky, and it can really just stop a lot of decks in its tracks. But I like the comment that you made about it struggling to close out games. It's one of those ones where if your opponent does come back from that shift in momentum, then you might struggle to get across the line. You need to power up some really big Zacians to take some knockouts. Sam, how do you feel about its position in the meta at the moment? Do you think that it's good enough, or do you think maybe it's just going to miss out?
I don't mind it, man. Like, I mean, it's definitely different. We've seen it kind of float around a bit here and there. We saw lots of God, words are hard apparently.
That's all right. I struggle with them all the time as well. Don't worry about it.
We saw lots of greens iterations of the deck, obviously, a while back. But I actually kind of like how it's sitting in the meta. It's definitely a bit of a sleeper deck. It does have a few tricky matchups, but I do like one card that I actually received recently through the League Battle decks that it's been using, which is actually the Apom promo.
Okay.
Which gives it somewhat of a matchup against Mill purely because of this Apom, which is kind of cool.
Okay.
I was always worried about Luca Metal because I was like, well, it's a really good stall deck until it plays any other form of stall. But now with the Apom, actually has a chance against it, so I don't mind it for that.
Okay.
Definitely I would say a more fun way of running like Disruption compared to your regular Mill and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, it could be a pretty solid deck for this meta. We'll have to wait and see, though. I think 1.5 is fine, though. It's definitely good enough for that.
Absolutely. Now, there are some people who are super upset in the chat because we haven't talked about it yet. So we will talk about Spiritomb now. Spiritomb is obviously very popular, but I really don't know where it fits at the moment. It's obviously really strong, but I'm not comfortable in saying that it's tier 1. I'm not sure about tier 1.5, but it's definitely not tier 2, so that suggests to me that maybe it does need to sit in that 1.5 slot. It's obviously strong against Dragapult. If you can take some knockouts with these one prize attackers, you'll be really far ahead, but there's obviously that low HP cap that Dragapult can just capitalize on, so it's a real swing of kind of swings and roundabout situation. I'm not sure what else to say about it. It's really good, but is it going to be good enough? I'm not sure. Sam, what do you think?
I'll be honest, man. I'd put it in tier 1.
Tier 1?
I think the most recent iterations of Spiritomb have shown that through things like Aurora and Rainbow, players are able to capitalize on a variety of different attackers, similar to how, you know, Henry Brand revolutionized Mewtwo in saying, well, we have 8 different kinds of Rainbow energy, essentially, and there's so many different attackers. You know, they've used the Sledgehammer Buzzwell. Recently, they've used Doom Counter Veltool. And I know, like, back in the day, they used to use things like Frostlass when Charizard was running around, but obviously it's not anymore.
No.
So I like that the deck has a lot of versatility to it. Black Market, if you can't get rid of it, is a really annoying stadium.
Yep.
So against decks like Blacephalon that have a very low stadium count, if they've wasted both of their stadiums early game and you put down a black market, then you can put yourself in an incredibly favorable position to just win that matchup. I don't know, I think it's just got a lot going for it. There's two different versions. Obviously, there's the version with a whole smattering of Pokemon and just using the Spiritombs. And there's also ADP Spiritomb, which I still think has a place in the meta, especially if people are expecting a lot of these mill decks to show up. Then obviously having ADP's Alter Creation is a huge benefit to that, given that Spiritomb only needs an energy to attack each turn, and once it's set up, can just start one-shotting everything in mill decks. So, I don't know. I still think it's a really solid deck in the meta, and comparing it to Dragapult and Turbo Zacian, I honestly think it's tier 1.
Okay, well, Stefan, you can be the swing vote here. Sam's kind of convinced me a little bit. Do you think this should go up in the top?
Jeez, that's a tough one, man.
I know, it's right in the gap. If only we had a 1.25 section.
Yeah, I wouldn't feel bad about putting it in 1, to be honest. I think it does kind of the opposite of what Luca Metal does, whereas it aggressively counters Dragapult rather than defensively countering it. But I also think its ability to like breakpoint certain damage numbers, like 3 counters and a Hustle Belt gets you a Dedenne kill. And then the versatility of all the different Pokemon and ADP variants. I wouldn't feel bad about putting it in tier 1. Yeah, I could agree with Sam.
Okay, cool. No worries. Well, I think I've been kind of semi-outvoted there. There's a lot of argument going on in the chat. 1.51. I think we'll leave it in tier 1 because we've got one last deck to look at. It's the one that we featured in yesterday's video on YouTube, which was Galaxy Mewtwo or Ultimate Mewtwo or whatever variant of Henry Brand's Mewtwo you are currently playing. This deck is really tough to rank because it is less about the cards in the deck and more about the quality of the player. And when Henry plays Mewtwo, it's like a tier 1 deck. But when I play Mewtwo, it goes all the way down to the very, very bottom of the screen. Like, I just can't get it to work as well as he can. Sam, I know you've had a lot of practice with these kind of Ultimate Mewtwo, Galaxy Mewtwo lists. Where do you think it sits? You've probably got a better idea than I have.
I think 1.5 is probably fair enough for it. I think in a really good player's hands, like you said, it is an incredibly strong deck. If you know all the sequencing, all the certain combos, but also the tricky part with Mewtwo is it's similar to Spiritomb in the sense that there are so many techs that you can put into the deck, and there are probably going to be a bajillion lists coming out of the Players' Cup that are all going to have 1 or 2 just little different techs. Like, some might be running ADP Zacian, some might be running Xerneas, some might be running Buzzmosa. We just don't know. And those little changes are the difference between doing really well in some matchups and doing really poorly in others. I think that Mewtwo still does suffer from a pretty rough Blacephalon matchup, which doesn't help, but Galaxy Mewtwo, in the same vein as Ultimate Mewtwo, does have an okay matchup against Mill due to the fact that it can use Alter Creation plus Alolan Eradicate GX without any energy needed to get knockouts, which is fantastic. But I do feel that it's probably not on the same level as things like Dragapult and Zacian and whatnot. It's heavily dependent on getting Swell out, because without Swell, it can be in a lot of danger from Power Plant into Dragapult, which is a huge thing. And also, Zacian just being so fast compared to the Galaxy Mewtwo, which only attaches once per turn, can be a little bit overwhelming for it in some situations. So I think 1.5 is safe. It definitely has the ability, with the right build, to do incredibly well, but I have no idea what that build is yet.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Stefan, what about you, mate? What some closing comments on Mewtwo and MewGX?
Yeah, I think you've summed it up pretty well. I mean, if we were titling this, what tier list for what Henry Brand will play in the Players' Cup,
like,
I think we can load that one right up to tier 1. But I think for quite a lot of people that are going to be like watching this and thinking about what they might be playing for Players' Cup, I would put this in like 1.5 to 2. It is an incredibly powerful deck, but it requires so much time and effort to wrap your head around and know what to do, and then one sequencing error can just make this deck fall apart.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. And that's all the decks that we're going to talk about. Obviously, remember that Baby Blacephalon is in that tier 1.5 as well. We just couldn't get the picture to work for whatever reason. But one last closing comment that I'd like to make about this tier list, something that I hadn't really thought about until I was putting together the decks, is that if we think of tier 1 and tier 1.5 as decks that we could reasonably play and expect to see some success with, then this format is probably one of the most diverse and interesting formats we've had in a very long time. There are 9 decks that we've said tonight that you could reasonably expect to pick up and take into the Players' Cup and do well with. And that for me is a massive plus. Props to the Pokemon Company for developing cards that have kind of organized themselves into this really interesting metagame. Obviously there are decks that are better than others, but ultimately I think the fact that we could choose between any one of these 9 and still expect to do well is a really, really good thing. I think that's it. I think that's all we've got to say. Any last closing statements, guys?
No, none from me.
No, not really.
Beautiful.
I'm good.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we've wrapped it up beautifully for the moment. Obviously, this tier list is just our opinion, so if we've done something wrong, then comment down below and tell us all about it. I'm sure that we'll be happy to have a chat with you about it. And hey, good luck for the Players' Cup whenever it is for you, Saturday, Sunday, and into the future. If you're watching this one on YouTube, as most of you probably are, then there's a button over here, I think it is. What's above me? I don't know, whatever it is, that you can click to subscribe. Over on the other side, there'll be some videos that YouTube thinks you'll like, as well as a playlist down below me that has some Rebel Clash gameplay in it. And hey, apart from that, thanks everyone for coming along. We'll see you next time for more from the Sableyes. Bye.